Hello, I'm John Joss, and I'm going to be your guide as we visit three of England's most glorious gardens. To call them simply gardens is perhaps inappropriate, for they are truly masterpieces of design, lifetime works of incredible beauty. These are the triumphs of four extraordinary gardeners, none like the other, yet all with the vision, the unyielding optimism, and the brilliance to turn barren, derelict, or hostile patches of earth into separate worlds of breathtaking beauty. The quiet and reclusive Major Lawrence Johnston, Graham Stuart Thomas, who has been called one of the greatest living gardeners of our time, and of course the legendary romantic partnership of Vita Sackville-West and Harold Nicolson. Before we start our excursion, one rather significant issue needs to be addressed. That is the naming of the many plants that we will see. Some of them, like foxglove, honeysuckle, and poppy, have common names, but many do not. So as a result, you will frequently hear the botanical name used to identify a particular plant. But don't be intimidated by these sometimes odd-sounding Latin names. You'll gradually get comfortable with them, and later, with a little practice, you can impress your friends with your gardening expertise. Well, enough preamble. Let's head west for the county of Gloucestershire and the peaceful Cotswold countryside. Some 4 miles north of the small market town of Chipping Campden, deep in the leafy English countryside, lie the tiny hamlets of Hidcote Boyce and Hidcote Bartrim. Between these villages, surrounded by its own farmland and a handful of thatched cottages, stands Hidcote Manor. The 17th century manor house, built of typical mellow Cotswold limestone, is substantial and unpretentious. It has a small chapel at the entrance and an ample courtyard. But it is what is immediately behind the manor house that has made this a very special place, a veritable mecca for visitors from every part of the world. It is the spellbinding garden at Hidcote Manor. This national treasure is the towering achievement not of an English man or woman, but an American-born gardener, Major Lawrence Johnston. It was Johnston's mother, the wealthy Mrs. Gertrude Winthrop, who purchased Hidcote and its 280 acres for her son at auction in 1907. Johnston, shown in this, one of few surviving photos, was a very private man, and to this day, very little is known about him. During the 40 years that it took him to create Hidcote, he left no diaries, apparently made no plans, and kept no plant lists. Photos, too, of the early stages of the garden are exceptionally rare. This of the fuchsia garden, with its rather undernourished-looking topiary birds, and a view across the old garden, were both taken in 1910. Very few other records of any kind exist. This map shows the garden as it exists today. As you study the layout carefully, you can see that Hidcote is really many gardens within one. There's no set route through the garden, and at each turn there's a new surprise, another secret to be discovered. Let's start our tour in the old garden because of its proximity to the manor house, one of the first to be designed by Johnston. Bounded on 3 sides by old rose-colored brick walls, this is perhaps everybody's perception of the quintessential English garden. A wide grass path forms a center axis, dividing the 2 expansive main borders, which at first sight overwhelm the eye with their sheer beauty. In summer, these are given to color schemes predominantly of blue and pink, punctuated occasionally with flourishes of white and red. These borders are stunning, both in their size and abundance of flowering shrubs, roses, and herbaceous plantings. Elegant stands of Cambridge blue iris thrust up between frothy mounds of dusty pink thalictrum. Here and there, billowy patches of white abutilon, tall Shasta daisies, and the purple-smudged Philadelphus belle étoile give the eye a rest from the brilliant blues of Anchusa Loddon Royalist and the tall geranium Silestemon. There's Campanula, Hibiscus, Salvias, Felicia, the Verbena Hidcote, drifts of downy lamb's ears spreading a silvery carpet to blur the edges, and much more. In the back of the border, the heady blooms of the hybrid musk roses Felicia and Vanity nod their approval. Taking the narrow path that forms the perimeter wall, the old garden takes on more of a cottage garden look. Here the planting is profuse, no earth in sight, as an exuberant hodgepodge of shrubs and perennials vie for attention. The path itself is made of old, mushroom-shaped staddle stones, used originally to support hayricks. The odd-shaped ones being the bases, and the round ones the tops. A paradise for bees and butterflies. And, of course, garden lovers. The essence of Hidcote is, wrote eminent Rosarian Graham Stuart Thomas, a garden of boundless variety, soberly controlled. At one moment intricate and secluded, the next lavish and grand. But perhaps the single characteristic that makes Hidcote unique among all gardens is Johnston's brilliant use of living hedges to define individual gardens and the whole. These garden rooms, as they are called, open onto a variety of corridors. But these are corridors of yew, box, holly, hornbeam, and copper beech. Openings in these corridors form exits and entrances that cleverly beckon or flash glimpses of pleasures and views to come in the next or neighboring rooms. Let's wander into another garden, two gardens actually, the adjoining fuchsia and pool gardens. Here one can fully appreciate the architectural beauty of Hidcote's living walls. In particular, the tapestry hedges of mixed green and purple beech, a Hidcote trademark. In direct contrast to the studied abandon of the old garden, here we encounter classic symmetrical design, the use of differing levels to further define the spaces. Plump topiary birds sit atop a yew hedge that divides the gardens. From an arched entrance, the eye is led in a straight line down the path, across the pool, to the Palladian yew portico, and on to the grassy roundel beyond. In these gardens, planting is both restrained and tailored, with box-edge, parterre beds filled with dwarf fuchsias. In spring, these are planted with blue scilla. Retracing our steps up and out of the fuchsia garden, past the honeysuckles sunbathing on top of an old brick wall, we encounter our next surprise, a sudden and dramatic change in scale. This enormous open space is the theatre lawn. Large areas such as this are often referred to as the lungs of a garden, spaces that offer breathing room as one emerges from smaller, more intimate rooms. The lawn is flanked on both sides by tall yew hedges and is guarded at one end by 4 stately hornbeam trees. The majestic old beech, the central feature at the other end of the lawn, is one of the 2 trees that existed at Hidcote prior to Johnston's arrival. Moving from room to room, through topiary arches artfully clipped out of blocks of yew and holly, secret doors and elegantly scrolled iron gates, the scope of Johnston's originality with design becomes more and more apparent. This, the White Garden, is yet another example of how topiary is used not only to contain the space, but also to perform as a featured part of the garden design itself. Stylized topiary doves are sheltered by tall hedges with gracefully curved topiary arches on balusters and over entrances. It takes the gardeners countless man-hours to erect scaffolding and to hand-clip these tall masses of hedging. As the name would suggest, this garden is the domain of plants white and grey. Among these are the foamy blossoms of tall Cranby cordifolia, white campanula, lamium, and the delicate blossoms of the herb feverfew, frosty artemisia, and the alabaster blossoms of the small German floribunda rose Gruß an Aachen. The magnificent cedar of Lebanon, spreading its horizontal boughs like a protective guardian, presides over the neighboring maple garden. While the number of maples has dwindled over recent years, the survivors are superb, as with this graceful Acer palmatum, just washed by a recent shower. This elegant, protected little garden is also home to several varieties of hydrangea, heliotrope, and beds bursting with the intense, magenta-colored geranium xylostemon. In her book Hidcote Manor Garden, Anna Pavord suggests that there is no evidence that either Johnston or his mother had previous experience in garden making. With their peripatetic lifestyle, it seemed unlikely that they had ever stayed anywhere long enough to see a tree grow. Further evidence of this hypothesis would be the site on which he elected to create his masterpiece. It was far from the perfect canvas. It was too high, exposed to the elements. The terrain sloped off awkwardly in all directions. Even the ground was a bit on the heavy side. To gain some appreciation of the techniques in which Johnston transformed this inhospitable site, there may be no better area than the north-south axis of the garden, the Long Walk. One of these two handsome brick gazebos faces out to the Long Walk. And as you can see, a long walk it is. The land here slopes dramatically, and Johnston has maximized this change in elevation with the use of two ribbons of clipped hornbeam hedges to draw the eye up to the promise of what lies off in the distance, beyond the two brick pillars, with nothing but sky beyond. As you can imagine, there's always work for hedge trimmers at Hidcote. No English garden would be worthy of the name without a special place for roses. In the case of Hidcote, it is the Rose Walk. To sit on the white cast-iron bench at the top of these lovely rose borders is as close to paradise as one can be in any garden. The balmy June air is saturated with the heady perfume of antique roses from centuries past: Gallicas, Bourbons, Rugosas, Moss, and Damask. Summer companions in the borders include peonies, penstemon, cranberry, and various forms of sage and pinks, jostling their way onto the warm path. This, possibly the oldest Gallica rose in cultivation, Rosa Gallica officinalis, is also known as the apothecary's rose, and its lovely striped sport, Rosa mundi. Was this extraordinary achievement at Hidcote totally without inspiration, completely original? Or did Lawrence Johnston avail himself of ideas being presented by other gardeners of the day? It is acknowledged that if anybody provided Johnston with inspiration and guidance, it would be Nora Lindsay, who in the 20s exerted considerable influence on the English gardening scene. According to her obituary in the Times, she could trace out a whole garden with the tip of an umbrella. Certainly these lush plantings he called his red borders would suggest that it was also unlikely that he evaded the influence of Gertrude Jekyll, now considered the most important garden authority of the early 20th century. Johnston's frequent sojourns in France, where he also owned property and a garden near Mentone, no doubt inspired the precise and playful stilt garden. The palisades à l'italienne, or empty boxes as they are more aptly called, are sculpted from hornbeam. They are clipped once a year, and the task is performed entirely by hand and by eye. Looking back down the long alley, the line of sight passes through the red borders to the stately cedar of Lebanon and to the old garden in the distance beyond. It would seem appropriate that Major Johnston would include in his grand scheme a garden dedicated to his mother. Whether they were her favorite colors is not known, but this delightful Mediterranean-inspired corner of Hidcote is inhabited mostly by what some would consider a rather daring mix of yellow and blue flowers. Butter-colored daylilies wave over a blanket of golden creeping jenny. Starbursts of yellow allium compete with the strident blues of neighboring violas and the herb comfrey. In the back of the beds, tall euphorbias and golden hops add more yellow. Extra blues are provided courtesy of the puffy wedgwood blooms of the shrub Ceanothus. Spiky agaves create the backdrop, with containers of bronze-colored cordyline in center stage on the circular brick platform and curved steps. While all of these rooms, open spaces, magnificent borders, ingenious vistas, the formal and informal, are all individual examples of this horticultural cornucopia, the true brilliance in Johnston's design is perhaps the manner in which they all interconnect to form part of the whole. Another eminent gardener of the time, Vita Sackville-West, put it succinctly: luxuriance is everywhere, a kind of haphazard luxuriance, which of course comes neither by hap nor hazard at all. A parade of lofty English yew pillars anchored on square pedestals give this garden its name, the Pillar Garden. While the topiary and framework of parallel paths, angular beds, and layers of shallow terraces suggests a distinctly Mediterranean influence, the plantings in some sections of the garden are not quite so formal. In the height of summer, as the last petals fall off the blousy peonies, a cottagey complexion of perennials takes over. Showy Philadelphus and white foxglove serve as a foil to bright orange alströmerias and fragile blue aquilegias. The aromatic lavender Hidcote traces the narrow pathways. Showy globes of purple allium shoot out of a dense cover of the geraniums Wargrave pink and Johnson's blue. The magic of Hidcote is seemingly endless. Saving the smallest till last, before we attempt to track down Hidcote's assistant head gardener, we have just enough time to linger over this serene pool which plays the featured role in the pine garden. Looking like giant, spindly stalk green mushrooms, a half-dozen clipped Portugal laurels are the stewards of this captivating sanctuary. A Mediterranean flourish is added with handsome pots of agave lining the pool's edge, where silvery foliage and muted colors prevail. Helichrysum, Santolina, cotton and sea lavender, and the unusual gray-leaved Tibetan berberis. Color is provided in the shrub border beyond the pool by the large geranium Silostemon Bressingham flare and the dense bush of the rugosa rose named Rosary de la Haye. We found assistant head gardener Peter Dennis down by the greenhouses in what used to be Hidcote's kitchen garden. During World War II, this large area in the back of the gardens actually supplied produce and fruits to no less than 4 hospitals. We asked Peter Dennis whether there is a conscious effort to maintain the garden, particularly with regard to the planting of flowers and shrubs, in the same manner that Johnston originally designed it.
It's a very difficult thing to actually do, to keep the gardens in that way, because there were never any plans available, never any plant lists to follow. Johnston made most of the garden, or seems to have made most of the garden, from his head or as he went along. His library of books was sold when he died. We had no idea what was amongst those books. We don't know what information he used. The only reference we've got is what was actually in the garden. The Trust didn't make a record or an inventory of anything that was in the garden at the time. It rather left it to its committee to sort out how they should run the garden as they went along. So it's a very difficult thing to do. We tend to follow what we know was there, in some cases because we've seen the plants, they've died we can continue that again. Or from memory of old gardeners, we've used that before now as a basis to carry on. In other ways, we try to plant in the same manner as Johnston would have done. We know his methods because we can see them in the garden, we can see how they've developed. We follow that example. We try to keep to certain colour schemes that we're told were in existence on the way he used them. It's very, very difficult. Without the information, it's almost impossible, but we try to live in the spirit of Johnston.
The next question we posed was one that is frequently asked of the gardeners at Hidcote. With almost 10 acres to constantly fill with plants, year in, year out, where and how do you obtain new plants to replace those that die out?
We tend to propagate quite a bit of our own plant material because a lot of it's difficult to find in commerce. Some of it's not in fashion, rather out of favour in the last few years, so it tends to be awkward to get hold of, although a lot of those things have come back into fashion as in the gardening world. Much of a lot of the stuff is original from Johnston's time. Some of them are named after him. There's one or two small plants that bear his name, so we like to keep those going in his memory. We like to keep the idea of the garden at that stage when it was its height, perhaps in the 30s. It's difficult to replace a lot of the old material. It takes some time to find some plants, so in a lot of cases, unless the plant's actually died, we have to propagate it ourselves to maintain its line. Some of the varieties were actually introduced by Johnston himself from plant hunting expeditions, so those are, in some cases, either propagation material or the very first plants that were introduced to this country. These things we tend to try and keep going as far as possible. Although we've lost many things, we try to hunt through lists to see if we can discover them, but much of the stuff isn't available anymore or not popular.
You can now see why Hidcote is considered one of the most important gardens in England and the world. We were only able to show you some of the more important gardens, so when you make your personal visit, plan to spend a lot of time, because there are another 15 designated garden areas at Hidcote that we had to skip. It's time to head due south to Hampshire, over the Wessex Downs, across Salisbury Plain, to another tiny village called Mottisfont. It is here on the manicured grounds of Mottisfont Abbey that England's eminent rosarian Graham Stuart Thomas assembled for the National Trust the largest collection of ancestral species and 19th century rose cultivars in the world. Mottisfont Abbey, or to be more precise, the Priory of Holy Trinity, was consecrated in the year 1224, though archaeological evidence suggests that it had existed for quite some time earlier. Over the centuries, the house itself has undergone a number of architectural changes and has passed through many hands, including those of Henry VIII's Lord Chamberlain, William Lord Sands. The site, well chosen by the Austin canons for their priory, is secluded and sheltered. Walking the impeccably groomed lawns, it is easy to imagine being transported back through the centuries. A sense of timeliness and serenity is heavy in the air. You can tell by the towering size and spread of the trees that populate Mottisfont that they are indeed ancient. Superb specimens of English oak, sweet chestnut, copper beech, and hornbeam cast huge dappled shadows across the bright green carpet of compact grass. With all this history around us, we are, however, going to fast forward to the 20th century and the year 1972. It was in the spring of that year, within the mellow brick walls that originally housed the Priory's kitchen garden, that Graham Stuart Thomas's collection of old roses would find a permanent home. It's as though this climbing rose over the modest entrance gate is beckoning us to cross the threshold into this enclosure of extraordinary beauty. This is the National Trust Rose Garden at Mottisfont. Unlike Hidcote, a map is not really essential to finding your way around because, as you see here, the design couldn't be more simple. The original garden is divided by intersecting pathways into 4 almost symmetrical lawns, each surrounded by spacious beds. The second garden above has a series of straight pathways radiating from a central arbor. Because most of the old roses at Mottisfont bloom only once a year, varieties of shrubs and perennials are planted in the borders around the lawns and down the long, wide borders that flank the central path. These provide continuing color through the spring and summer months. Although the allure of Mottisfont is principally in its roses, these herbaceous borders are certainly among the finest in any English garden. In this one, we counted no less than 30 different varieties of perennials, halfway up one side alone. But what makes them especially appealing is the painterly skill in which the colors are blended. Clumps of soft green Alchemilla mollis rub shoulders with showy pink drifts of the lovely geranium, Claridge Druce, Dianthus and Erigeron. And of course, the indispensable silvery lamb's ears, mixing amicably with all of them. Cheerful yellows are provided in part by dabs of iris, Cicerinchium, and tall Cephalaria, with sprays of frothy white Cramby cordifolia creating the backdrop. Now and then a rose blossom will nod among this happy medley of colors, as here, mixed in with these campanulas and dianthus. The effect, as you can see, is extraordinarily beautiful. But this garden belongs to roses. So many, in fact, that it becomes intoxicating. They scramble over walls, engulf pergolas, hug the ground, invade trees, overtake trellises, and totally overwhelm the senses. Often hybrid families are grouped together. Varieties of Rosa gallica line one path, richly scented damask another, hybrid perpetuals, Bourbons, Portlands, and moss. They all assert their powerful collective presence with full-blown blooms, exquisite colors, and formidable fragrance. Unlike most modern roses, these have been graced with names that somehow seem befitting to flowers of such beauty. Most of them of French origin, many of them named for women. In a nostalgic discourse on rose names in his book The Glory of Roses, Alan Lacey wrote, "I have a persistent fantasy that in a garden of old roses I might, late one evening, discover the women themselves, returned to life for an hour or so, walking the paths among the roses, inhaling the perfume and talking softly among themselves. I would love to eavesdrop on Marie de Blois, Madame de la Roche-Lambert, Lady Mary Fitzwilliam, and Lucy Bertram." Mottisfont's stunning rose garden contains over 300 varieties of roses, mainly those from 19th century France. It also includes certain species roses and hybrids so ancient that some are actually classified as prehistoric. Many of the roses in this breathtaking garden are varieties acquired by Napoleon's first wife, Josephine, for her collection at Malmaison. Hers was a love affair with roses that even transcended the warring between England and France. It has been recounted that while English warships were blockading the coast of France, the English nurseryman John Kennedy was allowed unimpeded passage to and fro across the Channel to supply large quantities of roses for Josephine's garden. Such is the power of the rose, which, by the way, also happened to be Josephine's middle name. Among the myriad visual delights with which Mottisfont rewards the visitor, this tableau is invariably one of the most memorable. Sprawling joyously across a brick wall, the buxom blooms of the fragrant English shrub rose Constance Spry frame the white Windsor bench. The eye cannot escape this charming scene as it is drawn down the line of waist-high box hedges that contain dense bushes of gallica and moss roses. Dazed by all this beauty, the sound of water captures the ear, coming from where the two main paths intersect. The central pool is an inviting and pleasant place to take a rest and let this sensuous onslaught sink in. While the pool itself is a simple statement, the low, spreading habit of the ground cover rose, Robritta, dresses it up in June with a mantle of almost solid color. The blossoms, like small porcelain cups, burst forth to engulf one side of the pool entirely. In a world of gardening, it is difficult to imagine a more lovely sight than the soft colors of old roses and bold clematis splashed against the rustic red of aging brick. The sweetly scented rampant climber, Paul's Himalayan musk, smothers this 20-foot section of wall. The lovely Viticella clematis, Étoile de Violette in its full glory. The 1894 hybrid perpetual Captain Haywood, they all say it so eloquently. A handful of apple trees, survivors from the original kitchen garden, now act as hosts to shrub and rambling roses. This enormous Gallica hybrid complicata certainly seems to have found a happy home. And this magnificent display, put on by Andersonii, an immediate relative of the common dog rose, is overpowering to say the least. Another more practical method of training these more spirited varieties is on rough-hewn wooden supports that you see here in the back of this armillary sphere. Look what happens some years later when this hybrid musk rambler Félicité et Perpétue takes over. Let's wander through this inviting arch in the brick wall into the second garden. Created a little over 10 years ago, here the scheme is more open and informal. Gone are the box hedges and lawns. The paths are wider, even a different gravel, grey in color, and occasionally we encounter stepping stones of wide granite slabs, edged with dwarf lavender and nepeta. The figurative center of the garden is this airy arbor, or bower as the Victorians knew them. A handsome black iron bench surrounds a hedge filled with the original Portland rose. The ramblers debutante and blue magenta take turns scrambling up the 8 oak posts. In a corner, tucked in behind these dazzling heads of Allium Christophii, with their masses of star-shaped flowers, we catch a glimpse on the left of one of the small tile-roof summer houses, created as a refuge from the occasional shower. With a major musical concert planned for his garden that evening, we were fortunate indeed to catch a few moments with Mottisfont's head gardener David Stone. We asked him first what the early days were like in the transition from kitchen garden to rose garden.
Yeah, the rose garden started off life as a vegetable garden. It supplied fruit and vegetables for the house at Mottisfont Abbey for the best part of 250 years. And in 1972, when the gardens were acquired by the National Trust, they retained the framework of paths and box hedges and yew trees and removed most of the soft fruit from the garden and developed the fruit beds as rose beds. Well, one of the advantages of developing a rose garden in what was a fruit and vegetable garden is that one, you've got a good deep soil which has been well dug and manured for many, many years. And secondly, one has already got established trees. Some of the large fruit trees have been retained for training climbing and scrambling roses through. The large herbaceous borders which flank the central path were developed in the 1930s and were designed mainly to provide cut flowers for the house. So not only did the garden provide fruit and vegetables, but also cut flowers.
We then asked the same question that we did at Headcote. What about the future of the garden? Adding new roses and propagation.
We have the National Collection of shrub roses, and the trouble is with any collection of any kind is that it keeps on growing. And we acquire varieties of roses from all over the world, from as far apart as East Germany, Japan, China, Bermuda, and they are propagated at Mottisfont and assessed for a number of years. And if we find that they are true to variety, they are added to the collection.
We felt it would not be right to leave Mottisfont without showing you, close up, some of the roses that grace this most beautiful of gardens. It's fitting that we start with Graham Thomas, the lovely yellow rose named after the garden's creator. It was these same old roses that inspired Kentish Weald to write in 1902. It is curious when one comes to think of it, how large a space the rose idea occupies in the world. It has almost a monopoly of admiration. In love and in literature, ancient and modern, it is a leading figure. There's a mysterious something in its nature, an inner fascination, a subtle witchery, a hidden charm which it has and other flowers have not. The rose ensnares and holds the love of the world. We must now cross the breadth of England to the edge of the Weald and the peaceful Vale of Kent. Sharp-eyed travellers on the small, quiet road between Cranbrook and Biddenden villages will notice the slender Elizabethan brick tower off in the distance across the patchwork of fields. This is the tower in which poet, novelist and gardener Vita Sackville-West wrote much of her 40 or more works, and the site where she and her husband Harold Nicolson created what conceivably could be called the most famous garden in Britain, if not the world, the garden at Sissinghurst Castle. Vita Sackville-West was born in 1892 into one of the oldest, most powerful families in England, the Sackvilles. It was one of Vita's ancestors, Thomas Sackville, who received Knowle, the largest house in England, as a gift from Queen Elizabeth I, so that she could be nearer her fine poetic genius, as she put it. With its supposed 365 rooms and 52 staircases, corresponding to the days and weeks of the year, the house alone covers 6 acres. The enormous treasure house of Knowle and its great park was to be Vita's playground through childhood and beyond. In her 21st year, she married diplomat-writer Harold Nicolson, and the charismatic, turbulent partnership that would last almost 50 years was forged. It was 17 years after their marriage in 1930. Looking for a new home and a place to create a garden, they purchased the derelict property that was all that remained of Sissinghurst Castle. During the middle of the 18th century, it was used to house French prisoners of war, and afterwards mostly demolished. In later years, it served as a hostelry for the poor, and subsequently stables for farm animals and cottages for farm workers. Even Harold Nicolson remarked at the time of purchase that it looked big, broken down and sodden. In 1932 they moved in and began the formidable task of restoring the 6-acre site to make their home and create their garden. Theirs was a fascinating and often tempestuous relationship. They were different in many ways. He was the architect, she the artist. He was sociable, she solitary. He favored classic structured lines, she the exuberant and romantic. Thus it was Harold who laid the all-important groundwork for Sissinghurst, the formality and originality of design, and she the opposite, in her lavish planting and unbridled passion for filling every inch of space with color and beauty. Were it not, though, for this happy fusion of differing temperaments, we would not have been blessed with this marvelous garden treasure. Nigel Nicolson summed it up eloquently when he wrote, "Sissinghurst survives gloriously as the creation of two people who had the courage to make a little paradise out of a ruin." Let's take a quick glimpse at the layout of the garden before we start our tour. Approximately half of the 6 acres is divided into a number of enclosed garden rooms. And, like Hidcote, it is the ingenuity of overall design and the manner in which the spaces interrelate to provide vistas and promises of pleasures to come that makes it very special. You can only enter the garden one way. That is through this arch in the pink Tudor brick wall that divides the main house on the right and the library on the left. Right from the start, you get a hint of Harold Nicolson's mastery of aesthetic design as you catch a glimpse of not only the next garden, but also a subtle preview of the one beyond that. The bronze urns, inherited by Lady Sackville, are from the Garden of Bagatelle near Paris. Once inside, we are in the Tower courtyard with its large expanse of velvety lawn, Irish yew centuries, surrounding high walls and generous borders. Some of the oldest plants at Sissinghurst are found here, particularly the climbing roses on the walls. The old stone sinks that serve as planters were rescued by Vita from the piles of rubble in the early days. The border on the north wall, however, is deeper and more vibrant than the rest. This is the purple border, and it gives us an immediate insight into Vita Sackville-West's audacious approach to colour in her garden. Contrary to the preachings of plantswoman Gertrude Jekyll, the most published border authority of the period, who condemned purple as a difficult colour to deal with and recommended extreme care in its use, we can see that Vita made her own rules. These are not Mottisfont's soft, sophisticated shades. This is a panoply of full-strength cerise, purple, magenta, mauve, scarlet, and more. The idea becomes quite apparent as we look at some of the plants close up. The tall spires of the deep violet Delphinium Chelsea star hover over acanthus, blotches of salvia, purple, pink, and mauve clematis, clumps of hot pink Stachys macrantha, the crimson floribunda rose News, and the sassy geranium Silostemon. On the walls, too, the regal purple clematis Victoria in full stride. On the south side of the courtyard, there is a small opening in the wall with 2 elegant wrought iron gates. Behind this wall is a setting of storybook memories. Of all her gardens, this was Vita's favorite, the rose garden. Certainly the most grand of Sissinghurst's outdoor rooms, it is also the largest. With its yew-hedged circle, symmetrical box hedging, and orderly straight brick and stone pathways, it is Italianate and formal in character, but somehow along the way lost its accent and took on a more carefree, overflowing personality. What started off to be a garden dedicated to old roses, Vita's first love, is in fact today a virtual encyclopedia of plants and flowers. While the profusion of blooms on densely packed bushes and arching sprays of roses are everywhere, the underplanting and companion planting is even more profuse. The fragrance of roses saturates the air. Hybrid, perpetual, and musk roses pass the time of day with old gallicas, bourbons, and centifolias. In early summer, they put on a mesmerizing display. Thrusting up between them, tall shafts of foxglove, hollyhock, and lofty yellow verbascum wave gracefully in the June breeze. Shapely mounds of the lavender hidcote throw off their familiar perfume as bands of alchemilla jostle with old-fashioned pinks, hardy carnations, and saucy sweet William to soften the lines of the path. And nobody enjoys it more than the bees. Just as we were about to leave the rose garden, we were fortunate indeed to encounter Nigel Nicolson. We asked him about his childhood memories of Sissinghurst and his parents' struggles in those early days.
When we came here in 1930, there was virtually no garden at all. There was just one flowering rose, which happened to be quite unknown to horticulture. It's now called the Sissinghurst rose. But this area here, which we now have filled with roses, was part of the field. And we took in this section of the field in order to create one of the 10 gardens of which Sissinghurst is composed. But you must think of this place as completely messed up with the rubbish accumulated over several centuries, and old farm carts and wire netting, bottles, tins, everything you can imagine. It was a total mess. And it was also raining on that day. And it was the first time that my mother and I had ever seen this place. And she looked up at the moment when suddenly the sun burst through the rain. And the gable up here, which is made of Tudor bricks, was suddenly flooded with light. And I'm sure that that was the moment of her decision. She said, "I think we shall be very happy here." And I said, looking around me and remembering my comfortable little cottage at the other house we lived in, "We haven't got to live here, have we?" And she said, "Yes, I think we can make something rather lovely out of it." And so there was no water, piped water, no electricity, no drains, anything like that. And we bought the house 2 weeks after that first visit. But it took another 5 years before we added the sort of comforts that people expect. And of course, 10 years to complete the garden, make the walls, plant the hedges, and to fill it with these roses, which you're seeing now at their very best.
While the tower was Vita's sanctum, it was in the small south cottage that Harold Nicolson did most of his writing and planning. Looking out of the leaded windows, he would be rewarded with one of the most cheerful and uplifting sights in all of Kent, the sunny cottage garden. Notwithstanding the quartet of Irish yew columns clustered in the centre, it has the true disposition of a cottage-style garden, but one with Vita's inimitable stamp on it, because it is composed almost exclusively of sunset colours, cheery yellows, golds, oranges, and warm reds. Crazy paving and old brick paths lead in straight lines through a sea of beds overflown with mostly herbaceous plants, including many old-time cottage favourites, the pancake heads of sulphur colour and brick-red yarrow. Impressive stands of buttercup yellow verbascum, fluffy phyllictrum, dusty orange lilies, alstroemerias, punctuated with graceful irises, dahlias, and nephophias. The occasional patch of white relief is provided with daisy-like anthemis and helianthemum. There's even a rose here and there, like this small floribunda dusky maiden. William Robinson, a prominent garden writer of the time whom Vita much admired, described the charm of cottage-style gardening in his 1893 book, English Flower Garden. He wrote, "It is the absence of any pretentious pattern which lets the flowers tell their story to the heart. The walks are only what are needed, and so we see only the earth and its blossoms." If anything or anybody inspired Vita's lovely cottage garden, Robinson might get the credit. The only decorative touch in the garden is this old tarnished copper boiler, which was salvaged by Vita in the early days. In summer it is filled with red mimulus. Fragments of the original Elizabethan walls are warm playgrounds for climbing roses and honeysuckle. The delicate white noisette rose that covers the cottage wall by the door is Madame Alfred Carrière. It was the first of the roses planted at Sissinghurst by Vita and Harold. The uncooperative angles of Sissinghurst's layout were more than matched by Harold Nicolson's cleverness in seizing every opportunity to reward the eye. Despite the fact that there is no direct line of sight, he managed somehow to give us a preview of the next event, over the hedge, down toward the moat. The focal point of the vista is Dionysus, the most imposing statue among the few at Sissinghurst. He was proclaimed a real triumph by Vita when he was first placed in position shortly after the war, against the dark mass of hedge across the moat. In line with the tower, just beyond the bank where the slate-colored water of the moat ends, is yet another intriguing small garden enclosed by formal yew hedges. This is the herb garden. The fact that it is just about as far removed as possible from the kitchen in the priest's house, where the family would dine every night, seemed of no concern to Vita. This jewel of a garden contains over 100 varieties of herbs. In order to achieve that number, certain names appear on the list that won't be found in too many cookbooks or medical journals. Melilot, Clary, Elecampagne, and Woad, to name a few. This is a garden for bees and butterflies. Little wonder when you see some of the leading attractions, like this borage, the leaves of which make a good salad ingredient, and the seductive colors of this stately Salvia turkistanica. Or, for a little more drama, how about these prickly heads of the self-seeding medicinal herb teasel? The centerpiece of the garden is a simple but charming marble bowl supported by 3 sculpted lions. This was acquired by the Nicolsons in Constantinople in 1913. The curious-looking red perennial filling the bowl is houseleek. Even small remnants of the medieval house are put to imaginative use, as with this charming brick and stone bench with its seat of chamomile. The orchard occupies approximately 1/3 of Sissinghurst's land area. With its wide mown paths and meadow-like character, it allows the visitor a welcome sweep of breathing room and an impressive view of the tower. Where medieval brick and stone once stood, the site of the original 15th century manor house, old fruit trees now stand. Pear, plum, cherry, but mostly apple trees, which Vita found made perfect hosts for climbing roses. This Alba hybrid, Madame Plantier, makes a pretty companion for this gnarled century-old apple tree. The last of Sissinghurst's gardens has become much more than simply a garden. This is Vita Sackville-West's fabled White Garden. And it exerts a very special mystique to those who see it at its best. In her authoritative book Sissinghurst, Portrait of a Garden, Jane Brown captures the evocative nature of this garden as she writes, "The White Garden is more than a part of gardening legend. It has transcended into general folklore, to be celebrated by painters, poets, photographers, and essayists. It is the romantic symbol of the spirit of this place, which thousands carry off in their hearts to homes all over the world." Nigel Nicolson is one of the few that witnessed its creation. He generously shared these thoughts with us.
There are 10 gardens at Sissinghurst, each one with a different type of flower or colour or seasonal flower, and of all of them this is the most famous. This is the White Garden, and this was the last one to be created after the World War II. It was before that a rather ordinary rose garden, and my mother had the idea suddenly of making a garden filled with nothing but white or pale grey flowers. And she carried out her idea, and you can see the result. There are about 125 different varieties of white flowers in this particular garden, and they make a wonderful display, particularly by moonlight. And we have a white owl here, which sometimes floats over the garden in the June moon, and it's one of the most magical sights I know. The White Garden is a very good illustration of how my father, who did the planning, and my mother, who did the planting, collaborated to produce something which is almost unique in the whole of England. You can see his touch very well in these box hedges, all neatly arranged in squares and diamonds, And in the shapes which she made by the hedges, she planted rather at random these variegated flowers. In this case, of course, every one of them white or pale grey. And this garden is probably her greatest achievement as a garden. It's been copied all over the world, in Europe and America, and I've seen it planted up exactly as it is, even in New York, in the Botanical Society. They imitated this garden, down to the very arum lilies, which you see growing here. Perfect flowers, but they only last about a week each. And a garden is constantly changing from day to day. These roses here, which are called iceberg, a white rose, not a single one was open yesterday. And I come out this morning and I find them breaking through the bud into full flower. That's the joy of living in a place like this. It is a constant revival, year by year and day by day, of something that she created all those many years ago.
We could not leave the White Garden and Sissinghurst without taking you underneath this magnificent canopy of Rosa Mulliganiae to hear the bees sing the praises of this most beautiful of gardens. Although she wrote it to describe a friend, this beautiful lyric in Vita Sackville-West's poem, The Land, would seem to best describe the poet herself, her love of beauty and of life. She walks among the loveliness she made, between the apple blossom and the water. She walks among the patterned pied brocade, each flower her son, and every tree her daughter.